His passing leaves a void in our community and a huge civic gap that will be very hard to bridge. Those were the words written by the Sacramento Bee just a few years ago about my good friend Sherwood Carthen. I had just moved to the Phoenix area, and a couple of months later I get a phone call on like a Wednesday or Thursday morning saying, David, just want you to know, Sherwood had a heart attack. They rushed him to the hospital, but he didn't make it. He was sitting in Starbucks that morning, writing the message that he was going to share with his congregation that day. The words written by the Sacramento Bee aren't words that you would typically see written by a liberal newspaper about an evangelical pastor. Sherwood Carthen was larger than life. Sherwood was 6'4" by 6'4". And he was very, very active, not just in doing ministry as a pastor, but having grown up in the African American community on the south side of Sacramento when racism was extremely prominent. He had a heart to marry ministry and civic duty. He had a heart to reach people for Jesus, and then to take the Jesus that had changed his life and use it to implement things in the community that would bring lasting transformation to the community itself. He was the chaplain for the Sacramento Kings. He was known as the Rev by the Kings players and around the city of Sacramento. He developed a program called Cops and Clergy. Generically, we called it Hug-a-Thug. He thought that the law enforcement community should work with the faith community to make a difference in the lives of young men and women who were being drawn into the gang lifestyle. As a matter of fact, about a year before I moved to Sacramento, Sherwood was with me in Atlanta, and we were sitting in a restaurant one night, and his cell phone rang, and he said, David, I got to take this. It was one of the law enforcement officials telling him about one of the young men that they had been working with who had gotten involved in the gang lifestyle and was coming back out of it due to this program. And the young man had just committed suicide. And I watched this bigger-than-life friend of mine, the Rev, the bishop, sit there and just break down in the middle of a restaurant and begin to cry. Some young man whose name he barely knew. Some young man who he had met only a couple of times is now dead. And it broke my friend's heart. And what he didn't know in that moment was that his friend sitting across the table from him, who had grown up in the hills of southern Ohio, but God had opened doors to do ministry in mostly fairly affluent suburban areas, who was a type A, task-oriented person, was sitting there for the first few moments going, why was he crying? And then as the conversation began to unfold, in ways that only the Holy Spirit of God can do, my heart began to open up to new realities. Sherwood went on to do some other things. He had the United Pastors of Sacramento, and he worked with them. He was the founder and director of Our Family Community Foundation that worked with parents and children that were trying to work through educational and cultural and social things. He was a longtime force in the community. He assisted the homeless on a regular basis. In fact, I think it was a Thursday that he was sitting in that Starbucks when he had the heart attack and died. The night before, he was actually speaking at a fundraiser in the Sacramento area to raise money for the homeless population, and the list goes on and on and on. The Sacramento Bee wrapped up that story with this next phrase. They said, the community's challenge now is to build on Carthen's legacy with the same spirit and determination that he embodied. And when I think about that, ladies and gentlemen, the challenge actually belongs to all of us. Would you agree? Not just to one person. If your heart beats in sync with the heart of Jesus Christ, then at some point in time, we must have that point in life where we come to see that God is calling you and me and every other Christian not just to come to church, not just to teach hope, not just to express hope, but to bring hope to entire communities of people, to our known region and to the known world, where people literally are living hopeless lives. Jesus talked about that in a very, very simple verse in Matthew chapter 25. Jesus said these words. Inasmuch as you did it to one of the most prominent, affluent people in the entire world, you did it to me. Is that what Jesus said? Why don't you read it with me? Inasmuch as, my brothers, you did it to me. That's the heart of Jesus. One of the things I learned through my friend Sherwood is that the areas of the country where I had been doing ministry, primarily Caucasian, upper middle class, fairly affluent suburbs, was that the school systems in the area where I was doing ministry, in the school buildings, were not the same as where he did them. Now, I thought he was nuts. It's all state-sponsored. It's school. I thought every school, because it was state-sponsored and taxpayer funded, all looked the same. How many of you are laughing at me? Yeah. I mean, Sacramento, it doesn't get quite as blistering as Phoenix, but it gets nearly as so. By into the late fall, up into the late October, and certainly from about mid-April to the 1st of June. And there were several schools in his community didn't even have air conditioning. The playgrounds, the equipment were run down. They were built 150 years ago and hadn't been touched since. It was very common to find hypodermic needles laying there. And it just started a snowball effect into what I and others began to visualize as what God was calling us to do beyond the walls of the church. But probably one of the most eye-opening things that happened for me during this time was when I come to recognize and to understand that the United States federal government anticipates the number of beds they will need in their federal prisons 20 years from now on the third grade reading scores of elementary school children. They also saw that based on, for those students who read below what is considered the third grade reading level, that there was a high probability that they would be in a state or federal prison by the time they were 20 years old. But then they found out that if they could find a tutor who would work with those children one-on-one and teach them to read, that within an 18-month period, if they could get their reading scores above the third grade level instead of below it, in 18 months, they would change the trajectory of that child's life, and it would alter the number of beds. Now, we thought that the community's probably not going to step up and do this as much as the community likes to talk about stuff, that it was incumbent upon the church to make this happen. Our church got involved. We had an older lady who was relatively new, and when we put out the call, she thought she had to be like a licensed teacher or something. And when we said no, Mary said, well, my kids are all grown. I've got a little free time. I can go and just sit and read for an hour, 3 days a week with a student. And she did that. Now, here's the cool thing. Stuff like that doesn't just happen like in Northern California where I had done some ministry. It just doesn't happen in other places or in what we would call mega churches. Do you know that stuff like that happens right here in Mesa, and it happens right here in Connect Church? Gene Plone, would you come up and join me for just a minute, please? You're going to need this. You're a soft talker. How you doing this morning? You're okay? Gene's been working really hard on the build-out. Your muscles are all fine?
Oh, they're sore, but it's a good sore.
Why don't we do this so the people can hear you?
Oh, it's sore, but it's a good sore.
So you didn't actually do a reading thing, but several years ago, our church got involved with basically a Christian school who were working with children that had some certain needs, and we started doing like a prayer partner thing. Why don't you tell our folks a little bit about that story?
Okay. Good morning, everyone. About 6 years ago, a few of us money changers were...
Now, wait. What are money changers?
Money changers, those are the people who go on Monday morning to count the offering that you've given.
Okay.
So we were there at the office counting the money, and then we were talking to Deanna. And Deanna asked us, this is at the former FBC campus, where Mesa Christian Academy was located. And Deanna asked us if we would like to participate in pairing up with a student who attended there so that we could pray for them and to encourage them. And we all said, well, yes, we'll do that. So the students' names were put in a hat. and I drew out the name Daniel. Daniel was an 11-year-old boy who had been adopted by the Mexican family and was born in the Ukraine. The first time I met Daniel at church, he barely said a word to me. And nor would he look me in the eye. He was extremely quiet and had trouble speaking English. I later found out that Daniel had been put in foster care early in life, never knowing his biological parents. That same foster family and even a second family later rejected him. So Daniel was dealing with abandonment issues, rebellion, and anger, among other things. Now, at this time in my life, I was still grieving over the death of my daughter, which was 2 years prior, and over the death of my husband, which was a year before. My life had been turned upside down. My heart had been shattered, and I was still hurting. But the Lord knew what I needed to help me to overcome the devastating grief and the depression that I felt. In his all-knowing, all-loving, compassionate grace, God put together two hurting hearts that could help heal and offer hope to one another. The Lord was patching up the pieces of my broken heart and filling up the empty spaces of Daniel's struggling heart. It was no coincidence that I drew Daniel's name from that hat. It was a divine appointment. So I began praying for Daniel and writing notes to him and giving him little gifts. Before long, he would smile when he saw me, and this skinny little cute boy smile melted my heart. I was told that when Daniel saw me, his whole countenance changed, and his face would just light up. His mom told me that his life was transformed by God through the power of prayer and his word, and through someone who took an interest in him. After a while, Daniel gave me notes, usually at Awana, when I saw him on Thursday nights. They were all neatly folded up and with a very few words, but with a simplistic, precious drawings. Eventually he wrote, "I love you, Mrs. Jean," on each one of them. He has a special place in my heart. God used me at the right time and in the right way to change both of our lives. I like to think of it as a miracle because I have no special talent or skills, but just a willingness to open my heart to God's wonderful love and allow it to flow out through me. Through Christ and the strength he gives, I was able to climb out of my feelings and reach out to another, offering hope and helpfully making a difference. So I just praise Jesus and thank him for his grace and his mercy. Our God is an awesome God.
Would you say thank you to Jean this morning? Thank you so much. So it really is just about working with the effect that we can have one child at a time, one life at a time. When we think about doing stuff as a church, we think about the holistic stuff and the things we send bodies of people to go do this task project or go serve at this function or go be a part of what we're doing with this Title I school. And all of that is wonderful, and we do all of that. But sometimes, folks, I think it's the heart that God has planted in each of us that is true to our personality that he wants to use to make a difference just in the life of one other child. It's often been said that Americans like to spend money they don't have so they can impress people they don't like. I mean, just a few recent examples of this, just from the kind of the circles that I have run in, is had an NBA player who had an ATM machine installed in his kitchen because he didn't like having to go out and look for them. There was a man up in the Lake Tahoe area who spent $20 million on a house with 11 bathrooms. I guess when you got to go, right? We asked, why did you buy that house? He said, because it had 11 bathrooms. Read recently about a lady who had purchased a diamond-encrusted Bluetooth headset. Y'all know what that is? The little things you wear in your ears that talks to your cell phone and allows you to hear and talk. She had one diamond-encrusted, and she paid $50,000 for it. Read about another man this week who was a business executive. He got a leather, gold, and silver Monopoly game for Christmas that cost $7,000. And I think about those types of things. Now, they don't have to be that extravagant, but I think about the kinds of things that you and I spend our money on. To some degree or other, most of us in this room have a little bit of discretionary income. And whether you spend it on diamond-encrusted Bluetooth or you buy 2 lattes a day, we're doing something with our money. And here's what I happen to think. I happen to think that when all is said and done today, in your heart, you might realize that being a part of this service this morning is going to cost you something. But it might also be the greatest ride of your life. Because maybe God wants you to think about in different ways how you can take your discretionary time and how you can take your discretionary money. And you heard Jean say, well, I don't have any special talents or structuring in this area, but because I was available, basically what she said, and she had a willing heart, God used her life to make a difference for how many people did you hear her say? 1. Just 1. See, this is important because I believe that the smartest thing you can do with your life is to make things happen that wouldn't have existed without you. See, most of us never think in those terms. We think about being a part of some bigger scheme or some bigger scenario. We think about being a part of a bigger group. But maybe, just maybe, whether it's on a very small scale or it's on a very grand scale, the greatest thing you can do with your life when you open up yourself to the possibilities of the Lord Jesus Christ is do the things that would never happen on planet Earth if you didn't do them. Over the years, I've given you, the last couple years, I've given you all kinds of illustrations about different things that I've observed or been involved in. And it wasn't that long ago I told you about the girls down in Mexico who gave their shoes to all the people there. I told you about some friends of mine who formed a little student group that helped work with sex trafficking young women in Cambodia. I've talked to you about high schoolers who have filled Pringles cans with cash so that they could launch a child survival program. But here's the reality, and here's what breaks my heart. This is where I'm living in my own prayer life these days as I think about the future of our church. Lots of us love hearing the story. And this is in your notes. But maybe today some of us make the choice that instead of hearing the story, here's your blank, we're going to start being the story. To be inspired by Jean's story or some of the things that I've shared with you over the past couple years, or to sit in your connection group and hear what God has done through someone else's life, like the Disleys or whomever, as they've gone out and done other things, that's one thing. But to be the story, when you step into God's story and you allow yourselves to be the story and not just hear the story, God then wants to position you to unleash hope to our world, to our community, to our region. Because we live in a time when there is more potential to do that kind of thing than has ever existed before. Some of you might be familiar with the story written back in the 60s by Lauren Isley about the star thrower. Let me give you the Cliff Notes version of the story. There was an old man who had a habit of early in the morning walking on the beach. One day after a storm, he saw a girl reaching down to the sand, picking up starfish and very gently throwing them back into the ocean. Young lady, he asked, why are you throwing starfish into the ocean? Well, the sun is up and the tide is going out, and if I don't throw them in, they will die. But there are miles and miles of beach and starfish all along it. You cannot possibly make a difference. And the young lady listened politely and then bent down and picked up another starfish and threw it into the sea. And then she said, I just made a difference for that one. Now, recently, a friend of mine rewrote that story for his own purposes. His name's Scott Todd, and here's what Scott said when he rewrote that story in his own version for today's audience. A man was walking along the beach when he saw a girl taking a picture of a starfish with her iPhone. Approaching the girl, he asked, "What are you doing?" "I'm uploading pictures of these stranded starfish to my Facebook page, and I'm asking friends to tweet the call to action." And then she went on to say, "The surf is up and the tide is going out, and if I can get enough friends out here, we can get all these starfish back into the water before sunset." "Little girl," the man said, "what does tweet mean?" The girl rolled her eyes, and then she bent down and she picked up a starfish and she threw it back into the surf. And then she gave the man kind of a little twinkie-eyed smile, and she said, "If you want to help out, this is how you do it." And within about 2 hours, thousands of children her age stormed the beach, and every single starfish was rescued. Scott's point, as he would go on to tell it that day, is that things are possible now that have never been possible before in all of human history. You and I live in a day and an age when, because of connectivity, we can literally, change can literally occur for at the rate of human history today that was never thought of. Diseases can be cured within months. Nations can be overthrown within weeks. Historic changes are happening rapidly where never before they were thought possible. I've been privileged to meet quite a few people doing some of the things I've done across the years, and the story of a young man in Michigan, his name was Toby. He actually wrote a letter or an essay in a school class on world hunger. And all the students' essays were submitted, and they picked just like 6 of them. And then what these 6 students were going to be able to do is they were going to be able to do like a 2.5-week study tour based on their essays in different parts of Africa. And Toby wrote about Ethiopia, and when he actually won and he got to go to Ethiopia, and he said when he got there he just was marveled at how beautiful it was. But he was also brought to tears by the poverty. And Toby goes on to say that one day he was visiting a distribution camp to hand out food and supplies and to play with some of the local kids. And as the bus driver pulled up to take the group of students on to the next site, this little 11-year-old boy came up and tapped Toby on the shoulder, and the boy stepped back and he kind of shyly looked at Toby's American jeans and American t-shirt, and then he looked at his own tattered and worn and thin t-shirt. And he looked at Toby and he looked back at his, and then he said these words, "Can I have your shirt?" Now Toby goes on to say that standing there in that moment, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. First of all, he was going to spend the entire day out in the hot African sun doing what he had been doing, and being a pale kid from Michigan, that was going to be pretty dangerous to him. And while he was processing, do I or don't I, or do I or don't I, the bus driver blew the horn, and the lead of their group said, "Toby, we've got to go." And Toby backed away from the boy, and he shrugged his shoulders and stepped onto the bus. But Toby says that as the bus drove away, the weight of that moment and that scenario gripped him very, very heavily. And he couldn't stop thinking about that 11-year-old boy who just wanted a basic t-shirt. Not unlike the ones that Toby says he had drawers full of back at his home in Michigan. And Toby says as he processed it that night, he couldn't help but hear the words of Jesus that you and I read earlier just a few moments ago. Whenever you do it for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you do it to me. Now, Toby says that while all the other kids fell asleep that night, he curled his head under his blanket and he began to cry. And he began to ask God what he was supposed to do with the grief in his heart, because he didn't feel like he could help that young man. And so when this high school student got back to Michigan, he started the process of creating an organization called Give the Shirt Off Your Back, because he was thinking about all of his high school friends and their parents and their brothers and sisters who would get the old t-shirts out of their drawers, and what would they do with them? They'd go out and wash and dry their cars with them. And then they'd do what with them? Talk to me. throw them away. So Toby starts this organization called Give the Shirt Off Your Back. He started out just going door to door in his neighborhood, trying to collect T-shirts so he could send them to Ethiopia to people like that. Well, the local news story got a hold of it. They gave him some airtime. Then communities around that community began to set up collection bins. And the next thing you knew, it seemed like everybody in the state of Michigan was giving him the T-shirt. He collected a little over 10,000 of them in just a couple of months. And he was all excited. I got all these T-shirts. And then he had an uh-oh moment. You know what that uh-oh moment was? How do I get these to Africa? How do you get 2 tons of T-shirts from Michigan to Ethiopia? And he was praying about that, and he began to call relief agencies and got the same answer. We'd love to help, but shipping is so expensive. He even called UPS and said maybe he could raise the money to do it, but he found out that it would cost $65,000 to send those 10,000 T-shirts to Africa. Finally, somebody put Toby in touch with an outfit called Supporters of the Sub-Sahara Africa. Long story short, they were an organization that worked with nonprofits across the United States and Australia and other countries to ship stuff to the sub-Saharan parts of Africa. And it just so happened that they had a shipping container in Michigan that was going to be driven to the coast and then was going to be shipped to guess where? There you go. Inasmuch as you have done it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you have done it unto me. Now, because I've been fortunate to do some things, I know all kinds of people like this who've done all kinds of things, but do you know you don't have to look outside of our little startup church here in a junior high in Mesa to find those kinds of stories? We have a story similar to that going on right here in our own church. Rachel, would you come up and join me? Good morning, Rachel.
Good morning. How are you, David?
It's good to see you up there singing. Didn't she do a great job up there this morning? As I understand it, Jeremiah's putting together a youth band to do student worship at youth group, and you're going to be the worship leader.
Yeah, me and Beth worked together on it.
Very cool. How many of you knew that? How many of you are glad to know that? Fantastic. So you and I have a common bond because we both have a heart for a certain organization that does stuff with children. Why don't you tell the folks the name of that organization and what it is you're doing?
Okay, so the organization is called Compassion International. It's an organization where you get to sponsor a child in a different country. You will for sure get them a meal for the day. You will give them fresh water, and they may be the only people eating in that house. My child, his name is Sosudu Pagalem. He's located in Burkina Faso.
Wait. How many of you have grandchildren named Sosudu? You know, I see Alexis over there with a brand new baby. If you haven't filed those papers yet, there you go. Go ahead.
But him is the only person who gets to eat in his family. He has a mother and father and 2 brothers, and he's the only person who gets to eat. And so what I get to do is the money that I make from just doing simple chores around my house, I give to my dad, and he pays for me to have my sponsor child in Africa, that I can give money to him so I can give him schooling, so he can get food, so he can get fresh water. And it's one of the most amazing things.
How much does that cost you? You're 16 years old. How long have you had this child?
I've had him for 4 or 5 years.
For 4 or 5 years. So you're 16. So let's just say 11 or 12 years old.
Yeah.
And it costs how much for you to have this child?
$35, I believe.
$35 a month. And what would you do to give your dad money?
Just simple things, taking out the trash, doing simple chores around the house that people every day can do. It's super easy. I get an allowance for it, but instead of keeping my allowance for myself, I give it to my dad, and he pays for my sponsor child.
And that sponsor child gets a meal a day, gets water, he gets education,
yes.
He gets medical and dental, yes. And he's got 2 brothers, you said,
yes.
And 2 parents, yes. And they get none of that because it's so expensive over there and they don't have access to it. I know that you write with your child. You correspond regularly. It's one of the great things about Compassion. Tell us about some of the correspondence you've received back from him and the kinds of things you're hearing from this child.
a lot of it is just writing letters back and forth to each other, like asking him how he is, how's his family doing, what he's learning in school, things like that. But one of my favorite things that Compassion does is they give you these little papers that they're like coloring pages. They will ask him to fill out a question, draw a picture, and then they send it to me. And it's what his favorite season is, what season it is there, it's what his favorite things to do are, and it's one of my favorite things that Compassion does because I get to see what he's doing in his life.
So we heard a little bit about the difference that starting at the age of 11 or so, you've been able to make in his life. What has this kind of just one-on-one ministry to some child you may or may not ever get to meet, what has that done in your life and in your heart?
It makes me want to do more. I've had him, like I said, for 4 or 5 years, and if I could, I would sponsor every single one of them. If I had the money to do it, I would sponsor all of them, because they all deserve to have food and water to drink. In America, we are very lucky, because we have that thing, all those things readily available to us, and they don't. And we don't understand it because we're so lucky in our daily lives to have it. I wish I could do more. I wish I could go and meet them and distribute food and water. I wish I could do those things that we have every day, but they have none of.
Now, you know that I have some friends who work for Compassion, and what you all may not know is I'm working with some of my friends there, and we're going to try and get you and your dad to Ethiopia so that you can meet him. And you know what? I don't think you're the only one who should have this blessing. I think we should do a Compassion Sunday. And I think Mother's Day is the perfect day to share compassion, because what moves the hearts of a mother more than caring for their children, right? Would you all say thank you to Rachel? Give me a hug one more time. One child at a time. We're not talking about sponsoring every child in Ethiopia or Zimbabwe or Cambodia or Indonesia. We're talking about making a difference in one child. Here we have Rachel unleashing hope to a young man she may or may not get to meet. This isn't a done deal, okay? I'm trying to pull some strings. We've got Jean Pallone praying for a young man who came to this country, and just the prayers that she made. We were talking in staff meeting the other day, and in our connection group leaders meeting yesterday morning about our community. I mean, Alta Mesa area of Mesa isn't by any stretch the most needy means socioeconomically in Mesa. And yet we can't help but wonder how many of the households that live in these nice middle-class to upper-middle-class homes that surround this beautiful elementary school that we're privileged to use. They've got mommies and daddies who spend all of their time working, and when they're not working, they're fighting. And their gift to their kids is, here's $20, go get yourself a taco, but they don't get any of the attention they're craving, any of the hope that they need, any of the joy that comes along with being a part of a family. And can we find families where this church, working with one child at a time, can make a difference? You see, folks, here's one of the things that has to grip our hearts, and if it doesn't grip our hearts from the inside out, we might as well shut our doors, shut down the building project, and all go to another church, because Mesa doesn't need another church. Whoever wins the kids wins the culture. Whoever wins the kids wins the culture. Is it the education system? Is it the Little League system? Is it the soccer programs? Is it the gangs? Is it the consumeristic culture that we're going to deal with come January? Or is it possible that we can unleash hope to a culture that starts here and spreads worldwide simply because we do it one life at a time? We've got all of these things going on. And there's nothing better, absolutely nothing better, than knowing that you're making a difference. You know, Rachel's story is very compelling. A couple of years ago, actually about 7 years ago, I was directing and hosting and leading a conference, Christian Leadership Conference, thousands of people there. And one of our guest speakers was a Chinese American by the name of Francis Chan. Francis Chan wrote a book back then called Crazy Love, and he's about as crazy as the love that he projects in that book. But Francis got up that evening, and he electrified the crowd at this conference when he said this story. He opened his Bible, and he read this passage of Scripture. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him. And he will separate the people, one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And he set his Bible down, and then Francis went on to talk about he had been working that summer at a youth camp. And while he was there at the youth camp, he met a young lady who was 16 years old, much like Rachel. And he was talking to her counselors and asking about her. And his counselor said, well, you should know that she works with a world support agency, and she supports 14 children around the world. And Francis was talking to her, and he said, you really do support 14 kids? And she said, yes, I support 14 kids. And he says, oh, you're still in high school. How do you support 14 kids? And she said, I work. She went on to say, I have 3 jobs in the summers. I wait tables, I babysit, and I'm a lifeguard. And he says, all of your money goes to those 14 kids. And she said, yeah. And then Francis said something that caused the entire crowd at that conference to go silent. He said, I'm so grateful for that 16-year-old girl who is supporting 14 kids, and I'm quoting him. She thinks saving 14 lives is better than saving money for a car. Are you still with me? She thinks saving 14 lives is better than saving money for a car. People might think she's crazy, but I think she's right, because at any moment now the Son of God is coming down from the sky in all of his glory, and not in a human or a veiled form, but in all of his glory with 100 million angels. And when he comes down from the sky, when all of his glory with 100 million angels, he is going to separate the sheep from the goats. Now, historically, in evangelical Christianity, we take that to mean he is going to separate those who have said yes to Jesus and those who have not said yes to Jesus. And in all of his glory, he's going to take those of us in a church who said yes to Jesus and usher us into heaven, and he's going to send all of the rest of the people to a place other than heaven. But what if that's not what's being said? What if this isn't a message about heaven and hell, lost and saved? What if this is a message about people who have said yes to Jesus and have used their lives for his glory, and about people who have said yes to Jesus but have gone on to waste their lives for their own betterment? Because listen to the rest of this story. Go to the next slide. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, and take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. And then the righteous will answer him and say, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you as a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go and visit you? And the king, in all of his glory, with 100 million angels surrounding him, will reply to you, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And I think about the need going on in Anchorage, Alaska right now. I was back there a few years ago. I've actually driven some of those streets you've seen pictures of. I think about the things that are going on and all across the country. But my heart got torn apart just a couple of weeks ago through what's going on in Northern California especially. See, when the media shows fires, they show the mansions in Malibu. They don't show the needy people that had their entire city incinerated, and there's not a single building left. not a home, not a hospital, not a school, not a Walmart. And my wife, Tammy, was up there providing aid recently. Tammy, would you come on up and join us, please? So you work for a Fortune 500 company that does pretty well out of Philadelphia.
Correct.
And you would probably, these people know how to make money. But I wouldn't say that over the years they probably have a history of being extremely generous with their money. But the situation in Northern California, which wasn't too far from where you grew up, gripped your heart. So in a nutshell, kind of give us an idea of how your company ended up giving some money, and then talk to us about what it was like there in that fire zone.
Well, I was up in Northern California. You all know that I travel a lot, and I was up there the day that the fire started. And I could tell there was something different about it. The sky was really brown, but it hadn't reached total devastation yet. I was there through the weekend, got back on Monday, and realized just how bad it was. So I worked with my vice president to see what we could do. And it hadn't been done before, but we found out that we lost a building. One of the nursing homes that we work in had burnt to the ground. In total, 3 burnt down and the hospital. And so we gathered money and got $1,250 for each one of our employees that lost not only their homes, but their jobs. And sorry. And one of the attorneys that I work with, and I had been corresponding back and forth through text message, and he asked, what can I do? And I said, they really need money. So he said, can I get Walmart gift certificates? We're talking about a low socioeconomic area. I said, Walmart, that would be great. So he immediately purchased them, emailed them to me. As soon as I got on the airplane, got to Northern California, I realized housing was going to be difficult. I had to stay 2 hours away from where the fires were, and went into Walmart, got those gift certificates. The next morning went up, and before I got an hour close to where the fires were, I had to put on a mask.
In your car?
In my car. The smoke was so thick you could taste it as we were driving up there. And I went with a gentleman, a coworker of mine. We went up there, and he made fun of me for putting on the mask, and shortly thereafter put his on. It just increasingly got worse. He thought I looked funny in it until it started making him choke. And when we got up there, we stopped at a Panera in Chico, California, if any of you have been up there, because that's where we needed to eat something before. We knew we were going to have a very long day, and we were up there very early. And I went in to Panera, and there was a fire captain in there. And I was touched by the exchange that was going on, and just thanked the captain for what he was doing. And he told me that he never thought he'd see fires like this again. With the fires in Santa Rosa and the fires in Santa Barbara, he never thought he'd have to see this kind of devastation. And it was far worse. On the way up there, you could see both sides of the freeway. It was completely black. The grounds were black everywhere you went. The sky was black, dark, dark brown. And the sun was barely trying to peek through, but you couldn't. There was this very ominous feeling in the town. And as I'm prone to do, I started crying, talking to the captain. And he said, oh, how are you doing? I said, oh, I'm fine. I'm just here to help our employees. And I explained what had happened. And he said, oh, just a second. Stay right here. He ran out to his fire truck. And came back in and gave me $350 in gift certificates, gift cards to give my employees, and just said, here, I hope this makes a difference. By the time I reached the location where I could go and meet with my employees, they had been now not working for a week. 6 days. And they met us there.
Were they still wearing the same clothes?
Same exact clothes since the fire. It was all they owned. And we were able to give them hundreds of dollars in gift certificates and a check for $1,250. And the hugs that I received were amazing. Just amazing. The embrace that I got from these people. We had given some of these people more money than they make in a month. They were dumbfounded by the money that we gave them. It was the most incredible and heartbreaking moment I had ever experienced. I really didn't know the impact we were going to be able to make, but it was so nice being able to give to them.
Now, for the sake of time, we can't go through all the stuff that I know you would like to share, but tell them about your new friend, Tom, in 2 minutes or less.
Oh, gosh.
We have a hard stop in here. We got to be out by 11:30. We may need some of you to help us get equipment out if you want to hear just a little bit more of what she has to say. Can you do that? Tell them about Tom.
So we were missing 2 employees, and Tom was one of them. Tom was about 70 years old, and we couldn't locate Tom. Many of these people don't have cell phones. They can't get on the internet. They're about 20 years behind in this area. The only thing we knew that Tom probably was at one of the evacuation centers, and we thought it was connected to a casino. So we went to go at about 8 o'clock at night, the first night that we got up there, to see if we could find Tom. All we knew is that he had a very old truck, and they gave me a very specific description of this truck. And we went and searched for about an hour, and we thought, we are looking for a needle in a haystack. There were people everywhere. There were trailers and cars, and you just not believe where people are trying to live. Tents everywhere, and I thought, we are never going to find this guy. And we pulled into an evacuation site, and I was talking to one of the gentlemen, just asking if he knew where people were. My colleague got out, and he thought he saw something that looked like his truck. And all of a sudden, I heard, Tom? Tom? And my colleague was calling Tom's name. And as he turned around, I saw his jaw drop. And I looked over, and here's Tom. We found Tom, he's almost 70 years old, living in his truck with his...
Didn't have any blankets or anything?
No,
it was
living
cold
in his
at
truck,
night.
no blankets, no food, with his 100-pound dog and his cat.
And he had lost everything else.
He had lost
life.
everything else, including other animals. He had to make a split-second decision, and those are the only 2 he could grab. And on his way out of his house, very rural area, he saw one of the neighbors that was there, and he asked what he was still doing, because they all had to evacuate immediately. And this gentleman was left to die. The people had left him there. So Tom said, get in my truck, and came out there. The gentleman was living in a tent on the ground. It was 25 degrees every night since that fire, and Tom was living in his truck with his dog.
So real quickly, you were able to get Tom some blankets and some food.
We went to Walmart.
Change of clothes.
And felt like Christmas. Boy, we loaded Tom up. He got more stuff than he ever wanted. And my colleague kept saying, Tammy doesn't have space. I said, I don't care. You can give it away. I cannot leave that man.
Did you get the dog anything?
Got the dog a bunch of dog food. Got the cat food. Got the dog a toy.
Obviously, she ended up getting Tom in a hotel. In fact, Tom called you the other night to ask him questions there, trying to get him into new stuff. But what was the impact of just being able to help for a few days? And you're going back up there tomorrow, right? To do round 2 of all of this.
Right.
So would you keep Tammy in your prayers? She's got to fly back up there tomorrow, round 3. Real quickly, what was the impact? We've got an idea of the impact you had on Tom and dozens of other people, as you could tell about. But in the midst of all of that, what was going on in your heart?
Oh, this. I'm a mess. I just want to do more. I don't feel like I've done enough. And I want to find Tom a place, and every other displaced employee. Some of these stories are just heartbreaking, and to me, it just touched me so much, the devastation and the pain and the hurt they've been through. I just feel like we have so much that I just want to give everything to these people.
Yeah, I'm scared to look at my next credit card statement since she's been up there. For the sake of time, we have to cut this short. You'll be available out front if people want to talk to you. Would you say thank you to Tammy? Folks, we absolutely want to make a difference in reaching people for Jesus Christ in this community. But we don't want to be a church that's just about that. We actually want to be a church that unleashes hope to our community, to our region, and to the world. Is that the kind of church you want to be a part of? And so we got to cut this short. We're over time. Ginger, come on up here. We're going to have to be quick. God, thank you for this conversation this morning. I pray that, as some friends of mine used to sing when we were just children in Sunday school, I'm so tired of being hurt, but not being changed. God, may our hearts hurt enough for our brothers and sisters that we would minister to them as if we were ministering unto you. That you would begin to make that the core essence of who we are as a congregation. In Jesus' name, amen.